Hello everyone, my name is Jennifer Hancock. I'm the author of The Bully Vaccine, and this is integrating behavioral psychology into reactive strategies to end bullying. And I live in Florida. I have an online learning company called Humanist Learning Systems, and the big thing that I teach is how to use behavioral psychology techniques known as operant conditioning to eliminate unwanted behaviors, such as bullying and harassment. I do use an explicitly behavioral lens, and I understand there's a variety of different scientific lenses to view the problem of bullying through, and all of these different scientific lenses yield different insights, and that's very valuable. I just come at it from a behavioral lens. And the reason for that is if we want to change behavior, we do need to use a behavioral lens. So when we're talking about creating reactive strategies, behavioral lens, we're talking about changing behavior, we need to start talking about behavioral psychology and behavioral science. That's me. I used to train dolphins in college. I went to the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I was apprenticed in operant conditioning techniques. That's a dolphin named Hiapo. And for animal trainers, behavioral psychology is not just kind of book learning, right? This is an apprenticed skill that you learn. It's very, very, very practical. And all good animal trainers around the world use these techniques. One of the techniques we are taught is called extinguishing a behavior. And if we're talking about wanting to stop bullying, extinguishing bullying behavior is exactly what we want to do. And the good news about this is that there's 70 plus years of research into this, and specifically how this works to eliminate unwanted behaviors. And there are no counterexamples in the literature. If you type in extinguishing a behavior, operant conditioning, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of articles in Google Scholar, and they're all going to say the same thing. It doesn't matter if we're training a dolphin or a human or a dog or a fish or a bird. It really doesn't. Even amoebas learn and unlearn basically the same way. So we should start using this. And one of the reasons we need to start using this is because it's very clear that raising awareness of bullying and the problem of bullying isn't enough to get bullying to stop. Our goal should be to eliminate bullying. And it's nice to let people know bullying is a problem. But you know, I teach EEO classes and for EEO officers, and I do harassment training and settlement training and things like that at my company. And what I can tell you is there is not really any evidence that asking a bully to stop or telling a bully, hey, you're causing harm, is going to make them stop. It doesn't. Changing behaviors doesn't work that way. You can't just say, hey, you should stop doing that because you're hurting people. In the entire history of humanity, hey, you're hurting people has never gotten a bully to go, ooh, I'm sorry. I'll stop. Now, they need a more targeted strategy. And this is a session on using behavior as a reactive strategy. Now, preventative strategies are important as well, but I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. When I first published my book, the school counselors at my son's school asked me to reach out to the Association of School Psychologists and suggest that they start taking a behavioral elimination approach. And what I was told when I called was, we're not interested in elimination, we're interested in prevention. And this is the difference between a preventative approach and a reactive approach. And as a behavioralist, I completely understood why they would want to take a preventative approach. And that is that behavioral elimination is the hardest of all the behavioral techniques to make work. There's one way to make it work, and if you don't do it exactly right, you don't extinguish the unwanted behavior, you make that behavior worse. It's much easier to interfere with the learning at the front end and prevent bullying behavior from becoming an established pattern of behavior, because it's way easier to do. The problem is, if we only focus on prevention, then we're leaving everyone who's currently experiencing bullying to their bullies, because if you're being bullied, you need a reactive strategy that's going to work. Ideally, something that is scientifically validated to work, right? That's the goal. And this is why I think behavioral extinction as a process that we know about through science is going to be really important as we create these science-based reactive strategies, because it's science-based. All the research on how you get unwanted behaviors to stop points to one thing. That's it. So let's talk about what the science tells us works to stop unwanted behavior, and how do we create behavioral extinction in general. So the first thing you should know, if you don't remember your behavioral psychology from college that well, we're talking about the B.F. Skinner stuff and the birds, is that there are now 70 plus years of scientific research on behavioral extinction, and there are no counterexamples in the literature at all. It doesn't matter if you are studying an amoeba. It doesn't matter if you're studying a human. It doesn't matter if you're studying a dolphin. It doesn't matter what species you study. Behavioral extinction follows a very predictable pattern that occurs always. This is kind of like established science, like evolution is. This is just what's going to happen. And you ignore what's really going to happen. What the science tells us will happen at your own risk. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing is you have to remove the reward for the behavior. If a behavior is happening, if a behavior is established, it's because that behavior has been rewarded at some point in the past, possibly being rewarded currently. The standard advice that parents give kids when the kid comes to the parent and says, hey, I'm being bullied, is, oh, just ignore them and they'll go away. Well, ignore them and they'll go away is one way to remove the reward. That's what the parent's trying to say. Stop rewarding the bully. The problem is the target of the bullying might not be rewarding the bully. The reward might be coming from the bystanders. It could be coming from a teacher. It could be coming from anywhere. It could be self-rewarding, right? The target isn't necessarily in control of the reward that the bully's getting. But this is what has to happen. If you want to extinguish an unwanted behavior, you have to figure out what the reward is and remove it. And you have to do that consistently. When you remove the reward, what the science tells us is going to happen, and again, 70 years of research into this, is that when you remove the reward for an established behavior like bullying, it's going to result in a behavioral escalation. What that means is that the animal in question is going to escalate their behavior to try and get their reward back. So I'm going to show you this graph. This is what happens. And you notice it's called blowout. That's what an animal trainer calls this escalation of behavior. We call it a blowout. I think the technical term that behavioral scientists use is extinction burst. And these two metaphors are very explosive for a reason. All right, so what's happening is you've got some sort of before state level of behavior occurring, and that behavior is being rewarded probably variably, not all the time. And when you remove the reward, the animal's going to do that behavior more in an attempt to get their reward back, because this is the strategy that works to get the reward. So they're going to do it more, and they're going to keep doing it more until they get their reward back. And if you are not consistent in removing that reward through this escalation, you will reinforce the behavior again, except now your new normal is much higher than the original level of behavior was. The only way to get through to extinction on the other side of this escalation is to consistently remove the reward through the escalation until the animal in question gives up. And in this case, we're talking about humans who are bullying or harassing other people. This is it. This is how you do it. This graph. I have a friend who does whistleblower protection in the UK. He's a researcher on whistleblowers. And I looked at his data and I'm like, you do know this, what you saw, what you're seeing in your data is predicted by behavioral science. This is exactly the pattern he was seeing. And again, there's 70 years of research that tells us this is exactly the pattern you should expect to see. And we do see this. The research on bullying with kids is that it kind of starts organically in grade school. It escalates and gets worse through middle school. And then by high school, most kids start developing strategies that allow them to ignore the bully, i.e. remove the reward. They can find their own peer groups, most kids, and they're able to avoid the bullies. And that's when we start to see the behavior tail off. Now, that's a generalization. There's some kids who never learn to do this. There's kids that commit suicide because of this. And we really need to start making sure that what we're teaching kids is this, that when we tell them a strategy that is science-based, which is to remove the reward, that we tell them what's going to happen when they do that. Because if you don't tell kids, I want you to remove the reward, however you're going to phrase that, and here's what's going to happen next. Your bully is going to get worse for a while, and I need you to be consistent through that until they extinguish. And here's how I want to support you while you go through this process. But if you treat bullying as a one-off thing and don't tell them about this, they will fail. Not only will they fail, they will learn that coming to adults doesn't work, and we don't want that. The key to getting through this process, and it is a process that takes place over time, and it can get worse over time, and it's predicted to get worse over time, is the consistency. There's two ways we reinforce behaviors. One is consistent, which means it happens all the time, and one is variable. Variable reinforcement strengthens the behavior. We don't want to do that. And I realize that doing something that's going to escalate the behavior seems really counterintuitive, right? We don't want to make the situation worse. But if we're not willing to go through, if we're not willing to go through the extinction burst, we're never getting to extinction. This is just reality. So helping people understand what this process is, what is going to happen through it, helps them be consistent. We also need to make sure that the people around these kids are prepared for this and can coach them through this so that they can get to extinction, which is what everybody wants. But failure to deal realistically with the reality of behavioral extinction leads to failure, and that's not acceptable anymore. So, opportunities for research and collaboration. There are a lot of ways that things that we can collaborate on, opportunities for research. Obviously, the big question is, does the promise of using the science of behavioral extinction yield the predicted results when we do it in real life? That's the big question, right? How best should we teach the behavioral protocol known as extinguishing a behavior in the context of bullying and for different audiences? Children are going to need to learn differently than adults, and organizations and so forth. And like if you're in a school, what is the role of the teacher in this process? What is the role of the administrators? There's a variety of different audiences that need to know how to do this. And how their behavior impacts this. And I can tell you stories. The goal should be for all of us is to create validated best practices that are grounded in science. And because we're talking about extinguishing a behavior, we need to be using extinguishing a behavior science, the science behind that. And I'm, available to help. If you're interested in adding a behavioral dimension to your research or to your project, contact me. I'm happy to help with this. My website is called bullyvaccineproject.com. All the material there is free. I explain the science in detail. I obviously didn't go into detail here because of the 15 minutes, right? But I have more in-depth videos that explain exactly how the extinction protocol works, how it gets applied to the problem of bullying and so forth. I also have a white paper, a 5-point plan to stop bullying in one generation. And that's also at the website. And that's doable. I am 100% confident that is doable. We just have to take a systems approach to make sure that all the pieces of the system, from the administrators to the teachers to the kids and the parents, are working together to extinguish the behavior and replace it with more pro-social ways of getting whatever the reward is that a bully's getting from bullying. So do contact me. I'd love to collaborate and help you out with whatever you've got going on. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Tracy Malarski, and I'm going to be presenting on cyberbullying in the COVID era, implications for youth with disabilities. And we're going to start just briefly touching on what is bullying. And bullying is defined by any unwanted aggression by another youth or a group of youths. And that also includes either an observed or a perceived power imbalance that's repeated multiple times or has the possibility of being repeated. And so that elicits distress, inflicts harm that can either be physical or emotional harm on the victim of the bully, of the person participating in bullying. There is some overlap between cyberbullying victimization and traditional bullying victimization. It was found that 93% of students who reported cyberbullying also reported victimization in that traditional bullying dynamic. Some ways that cyberbullying differs from traditional forms of bullying is that victims may not know who the perpetrator is or why they're being targeted. Cyberbullying has that potential to go viral immediately upon posting. And so that potential for repetition of the bullying dynamic is automatic. It's often much easier. We know that, online interactions have a higher likelihood of being mean, saying, harmful things, because you don't see the person at the other end. You don't see the harm that you're causing or the reaction that happens after, that sort of cyberbullying takes place. And adults may or may not know how to intervene with newer technology or technology that's newer to them. And so that is something that makes cyberbullying different in terms of how we handle it. More than 1 in 6 high school students reported being victims of cyberbullying. It should be noted that statistic, that data comes from a 2019 report. And so we know that because of increased online schooling and increased online socialization due to the expansion of virtual learning after COVID-19, that increases opportunities for cyberbullying. Online schooling has a unique increase of visibility for students to see into their peers' economic status, the way they live, their family dynamics. And so that is an added wrinkle into the cyberbullying dynamic, the capabilities that Zoom allow us to see, more things that may open up cyberbullying potential. Because students are digital natives and they have grown up comfortable with newer technologies, it's possible that that comfort level makes cyberbullying a more complex issue to navigate when it comes to concerned adults. During the 2017-2018 school year, only 21% of public schools offered any courses entirely online. Now, we know that everything changed in the spring of 2020 when all public schools in the US were closed due to the pandemic. And so this unprecedented pivot required teachers and students to scramble to shift to those online learning platforms and methods. And so some of those components of cyberbullying that are common to the broader bullying dynamic may look different when it is cyberbullying instead. So, you'd still have that imbalance of power, but it might happen because of somebody sharing something that they would not consent to, or they're potentially not aware of. And so just that lack of knowing or consent is a power imbalance. We talked briefly about the ability to go viral and to have that repetition, at a click. That is something that is a unique component of repetition within the cyberbullying dynamic. And intent. The ability to create online content with the intent to harm a peer is something that is common to bullying, but the way that that might manifest in cyberbullying is unique. And in terms of who is targeted, we have a focus on students with disabilities. And so for online victimization, students with disabilities are 1.5 times more likely to report online incidences of victimization. Those students that are targeted are often perceived as having differences, characteristics that set them apart, and those differences and characteristics are things that they have no control over. And so for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to just briefly touch on some recommendations within some context of things that lawmakers, family members, school staff, including mental health providers, and the broader community, including social media platforms, can do in order to address cyberbullying. I'm using the state of Iowa as an example in terms of state laws or statutes and how that can impact what schools are obligated to do. The Iowa Code Criminal Harassment Status 708.7 includes electronic forms of harassment. You can communicate with another person via electronic communication, but it has to be considered to have a legitimate purpose and also has to be considered a manner that is not likely to cause the other person annoyance or harm. And so if we know, in states that have these kinds of statutes, that there is that intersection, that connection, the nexus where there's a link to school and an online or virtual platform. Schools have an obligation to investigate and implement consequences and interventions to the students who are engaging in that cyberbullying dynamic. And so that's something to keep in mind. We're talking about the legal aspect of cyberbullying, especially as it relates to schools. We do have recommendations to lawmakers. We want to amplify these 2015 recommendations. And if you'll notice that, front and center, it's clarifying a legal definition of harassment, intimidation, and bullying across the board. And then it gets deeper into specifics in terms of steps for reporting, investigation, and prevention. And so that is something that we would like to see more of from our elected officials in terms of clear-cut steps that can be taken in order to prevent cyberbullying involvement. We want to address parents and family members to really rethink having static labels in terms of bully and victim. We now know that bullying is a dynamic process. It can shift depending on time and context. And for that reason, it's very important to know the warning signs of engagement in both the perpetrator and the victim bullying dynamic. Some warning signs are not necessarily do not pass go. This is for sure happening, but there are things to be really mindful of. If somebody is, always chomping at the bit to, get online or have their screen time, and they're suddenly shying away from that, that's something that warrants some further discussion. And again, if somebody is, seems unusually or overly concerned about online interaction in terms of popularity, or if they're just acting strange in some specific ways, again, that's something to really be mindful of, because we know that this is a dynamic process, and that it doesn't, it's not always the same depending on context. In terms of our recommendations for parents, not surprisingly, open lines of communication are vital, but within the theme of communication, we want to address the importance of perspective taking and discussing strategies to feel empowered to take action if there's some boundaries being crossed. Monitoring includes being proactive and also restrictive potentially if needed. Parents also need to be looped into what schools and community leaders are doing, including online leaders, including people who are in charge of platforms where our young people are socializing in order to take place the prevention of cyberbullying and intervention when necessary. When addressing school staff, we just wanted to briefly touch on the idea that students, of course, don't always use the term cyberbullying. This can vary depending on the community context, but I think it's helpful to just be mindful of the fact that, kids may be talking about this, but they might be using a different vocabulary than we would in our context. So that's something just to briefly touch on and keep in mind. We also recommend task force, including a wide variety of school community members. These members can be volunteers, they can be nominated, they could potentially be chosen by administrators or even elected. The other component of a school task force in order to address bullying in general is that it should have a social worker or behavior specialist, somebody who is familiar and comfortable with necessary behavioral interventions that are involved in bully prevention. And some just a closer look at the responsibilities involved in a bully prevention task force, the formation of bully prevention action plans, establishing protocols, including reporting protocols, data collections, communication and dissemination of information with parents, and implementing those interventions. One of the things that we really want to emphasize is the importance of universal social behavioral screeners, and that is a really vital role that school counselors and behavior specialists can collaborate with in terms of being proactive in bully reduction across the board, including cyberbullying. I want to emphasize that we certainly don't want to jump to criminalizing bullying behavior, including cyberbullying. But as the adults in charge, we need to know when to notify law enforcement because of certain online transgressions that we may come across. And so we wanted to briefly just highlight that and talk about the necessity of sometimes needing to involve police if certain lines are crossed. For our recommendations for school staff, we want to increase the use of those universal screeners. That's why we talked about having those school counselors and behavior specialists being part of those larger efforts, creating the bully prevention task force and action plans related to both in-person and potential online bully involvement. We want to talk about common vocabularies to communicate appropriate behavior school-wide, including cyberbullying, including digital citizenship. we want to integrate cyberbully prevention goals into our IEPs. So we want to include both goals and objectives when we are thinking about some of the social skills that our students with IEPs may need. And we also want to know, if a line is crossed, when to engage the police. And so these are a few of our recommendations for school staff who are concerned about cyberbullying in their school community. And so we just wanted to very briefly touch on roles for social media platforms and online outlets. We wanted to discuss about how some apps and platforms allow for anonymous interactions and others are set up to have identifiers. So it is more damaging for an individual to be cyberbullied by somebody they know, but the anonymous component can also lead to outcomes that we are looking to avoid. And so we wanted to note that cyberbullying can take many forms depending on the context and the platform. And we also had some recommendations for social media leaders, social media platforms. We spent some time making sure that we could find reporting practices, frequently asked questions about cyberbullying involvement. And so we want to encourage social media platforms to continue to post those clear instructions for parents and caregivers who are concerned with reporting processes. We also want to increase the focus on developing online early warning mechanisms in order to intervene as early as we can. And so we just want to wrap up with our call to action that we must have a plan in place to prevent cyberbullying. This includes working together to improve lifelong outcomes for all of our young people. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I wish everyone to have a wonderful rest of their conference. Thank you so much.